This is the premise on which I think we have to build the future. There have been a lot of reservations and concerns, but 3 agreements have been signed on standards and testing, custom clearance, and dispute resolution. And very fortuitously, India also liberalized its investment regime in April, and also integrated border post between Atari and Wagah was inaugurated with modern facilities that will allow more trucks to cross. And a liberalized visa agreement was signed between the 2 countries, which will ease the travel bit of the businessmen between the 2 nations. But the recent unfortunate incidents across the line of control have again, and the outburst of the media, have given a setback to these relations, showing the fragility and vulnerability of the process, but hopefully the relations would rebound soon. Now, the good news in Pakistan is that all the political parties, whether it is the PMLN or the PMLQ or the Tehreek-e-Insaf of Imran Khan or the ANP of Northwest or the MQM, which is in Karachi, they are all agreed on one point. They are fighting among themselves on every other point, but they are agreed on one point, which is that we have to normalize trade with India. This has never existed. Therefore, my plea today is that India, which is a much larger economy, and my calculations show that even at its best, the exports from Pakistan will constitute only 1% of the total exports of the total imports of India. So it's just a minuscule. It is a rounding figure as far as the trade volumes are concerned. But the goodwill which India will generate in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, by being magnanimous and not actually saying that we have to reciprocate on a tit-for-tat basis, is something I want to leave as a thought before this group of intelligentsia and the policymakers, and particularly the media. Because you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to feel threatened. It is a self-confident nation which has aspirations to become a global economy. You have to behave in that particular mode of thinking, rather than small, petty countries which try to create disputes for the sake of just point scoring. This is something which I wanted to convey very forcefully, that in all circumstances, the exposure to Indian markets by Pakistani exports will be absolutely insignificant. Therefore, my agenda for action consists of 3 parties. One, where Pakistan's expectations from India about trade liberalization, where I tell the Pakistani policymakers what they should be doing. And then the third is where both India and Pakistan have to work together. So first, our expectations about India's trade regime liberalization. India's average applied MFN tariff is 12%, but for agriculture it is 33.2% and 8.9% for manufactured. More than half of the agricultural products bear tariffs of 30%, 30. In general, these rates, along with the para-tariffs, increase twofold for textiles and clothing and threefold for chemicals and cement from the average applied rate, because there are para-tariffs over and above the custom duty. These four groups of commodities are of direct interest to Pakistani exporters, as goods belonging to these groups enjoy high revealed comparative advantage. India has also kept these items under the sensitive list for non-LDC member under SAFTA. And Pakistan is now the only non-LDC member because Sri Lanka has a bilateral free trade agreement with India. So 30% of all items included in India's sensitive list against Pakistan are agricultural goods, while 34% are textile products. According to my friend Nisha, the removal of Pakistani textile items from India's sensitive list will only affect competition with large Indian firms, not with the SME sector. Though they will oppose liberalization, the author believes that there was no rationale for protecting large firms. In essence, this high level of protection will apply only to Pakistan, as Bangladesh, which is our competitor in textiles, as LDC status, and Sri Lanka under FTA will receive preferential treatment. The detractors in Pakistan use this point as an argument that India is not providing level playing field to Pakistani exporters under SAFTA, and doubt whether the export potential under these circumstances can actually be translated into realization. Any action that allows the entry into India of goods in which Pakistan has competitive advantage would a long way to prove these detractors wrong. And that's what people like me want to happen, that these detractors lose their grounds of their arguments. After all, as I said earlier, the overall quantum of Pakistani exports, even if they achieve the full potential value, will hardly exceed 1% of total Indian imports. And the goodwill generated by this gesture will be enormous in rebuilding the trust between the two countries. The second point, that India's para-tariff measures increase the effective applied rate from the average 12% to 25.6% on average. In addition, as composite taxes are levied on certain textiles and clothing, the average protection increases from 9.6 to 16.2% for clothing. India's tariff regime also promotes tariff escalation as semi-manufacturers attract lower rates compared to finished goods. A review of para-tariffs, in my opinion, and tariff escalation will be very helpful in removing some of the impediments facing the Pakistani exporters. The third point, the three agreements signed between Pakistan and India on harmonization of standards, custom clearance, and dispute resolution are the steps in the right direction to ease the concern of Pakistani exporters about NTBs, but the actual implementation of the agreements depends very much on the discretionary powers of the lower government officials. And having been a member of the elite civil service of Pakistan, I can say this without hesitation, that this power is always misused on both sides, in India and Pakistan. And the apprehension is that the goods will be delayed on the border arbitrarily unless the senior officials make themselves available to take prompt, on-the-spot corrective actions. For example, Indian importers of Pakistani electric fans were all of a sudden faced with an arbitrary valuation by the custom authorities on the repeat orders that escalated their landed cost almost fourfold, making the Pakistani fence non-competitive in the Indian market, frustrating all the efforts of the Pakistani exporters and making the Indian importer actually suffer huge losses. Indian total imports of textiles were about $3 billion, while those from Pakistan were only 30 million, mostly in non-value-added textiles. On the other hand, total imports from SAARC countries, other than Pakistan, were $300 million. Thus, the Pakistani textile exporters point out the above statistical evidence that they cannot access Indian markets despite their price and quality advantage. The estimates of potential exports from Pakistan in textiles, particularly woven cotton fabrics, including denim and lawn, are about $365 million, almost 10 times the current level if the level playing field is provided. Fourth, as agriculture production is cyclic in nature, and the cycles in the two countries may not always coincide, it will be advisable in the interest of the price stabilization and food security to allow imports from each other's countries when the crop falls short of the normal demand. Perishable commodities such as vegetables, fruits, can cross the borders quite expeditiously if prior arrangements are made for SPS and other inspection formalities. I've heard the exporter saying that their trucks full of tomatoes were allowed to stay for 3-4 days. And this does not really lead to a better relationship between the two countries. Consumers in the country facing the shortfall in the domestic production will thus benefit from this exchange. And cold storage facilities should be set up on both sides of the border to encourage trade of perishable food products and fresh fruits such as mangoes and kinus. Tariffs on agriculture commodities should be lowered or waived off at the time of the crop failures and shortage to stabilize prices. Fifth, we very much appreciate India's gesture in opening up investment in India by Pakistanis. But there is no category for investor in the visa. You require continuous trips in order to establish your investment in Pakistan. So we suggest that the process of clearances and NOCs should be streamlined and a new category for investment visa should be introduced. A joint study by SDPI and CUTS International has estimated that India-Pakistan trade NTBs is higher than the South Asian average, which in turn is higher than the global average. Lack of clarity, transparency, and indefinition are the factors behind this. So there is a need to further work on creating a transparent NTB regime, where Pakistan needs to do its own liberalization and facilitation mechanism. Pakistan has made a public commitment to phase out the negative list and allow a full MFN status to India. Despite all the noise by the agriculture lobby, this commitment should be, in my view, honored. And it is quite an opportune moment, despite the fact that we have the elections, that there is no opposition from any quarter as far as this liberalization is concerned. We should not miss this opportunity. We should do it now rather than wait for some other movement. Then we should also open the land routes for additional commodities. It does not make any sense because road infrastructure in Pakistan is much superior. Why not allow more trucks to come to Pakistan and use that route in order to bring the commodities? Our infrastructure is, railway system is in a shambles, so we cannot carry it through the railway, so allow through the land routes. And as the volume of trade at Wagah border increases, there should be a need to open up other border crossings, not only just one. And this is something which Pakistan has to do, which is that India has built this integrated check post. And this has really accelerated the movement of the trucks. We have to build a similar kind of integrated border check post on our side. We have acquired the land, but we should try to expedite the construction of this post so that the procedures are curtailed right now because of the bottlenecks and the shortages. And we should also introduce, we have now one of the best software package, which is a web-based one custom software package, which is available at Karachi ports. I suggest that this should be done immediately at the Wagah border also. Pakistani exporters have to interface with rangers, NLC, customs departments, and anti-narcotic force with overlapping responsibilities. A single joint interface is recommended, and the present practice of multiple checks by these agencies should be discontinued. Fourth, unfortunately, since my days in the government, where we liberalized the import regime, in the recent years, the import regime has become more restrictive and complex. And our efforts to further lower the average tariff rate and the maximum tariff rate has hit a wall. Not only that, we have come up with these statutory regulatory orders, SROs, which are issued arbitrarily by our Federal Board of Revenue, which is not only resulting in huge revenue leakages, but has created an unpredictable and distorted import regime. Pakistan has to phase out these SROs and then put in place an institutional mechanism for the grant of concessions and exemptions, which is fair, transparent, open, and time-bound. The sectors that have been protected too long are unable to compete. High tariffs have led to a state of complacency and little incentive for improvement in productivity and innovations. A time-bound plan should be put in place to reduce the tariff rates and open up these sectors for more competition from Indian imports. Knee-jerk policy actions taken by the various governments in abruptly allowing and then restricting imported vehicles at different times without any prior notice have not only allowed the automobile industry to plan for the future, but they live still 20 years behind the efficiency production frontier. Where India and Pakistan both need to work together and continue the reforms. The first is that the governments on both countries, despite all the liberalization, still play a very heavy-handed role in trade and market exchange. The bureaucracy does not let it go, as they believe they know what is the best for the country, and the vestiges of inherent mistrust of markets and private sector have not been fully removed. Economic reforms since 1990s in two countries have brought about substantial changes, but the hiatus in introducing the second generation of economic reforms, particularly in the area of governance, is pulling down the momentum of growth. India's track record is relatively much better despite the present slowdown, as its share in the world market has indeed gone up thanks to a dynamic private sector, but still very far below its potential. My submission is that within the border reforms will do a lot of good for India to realize its true potential. I cannot believe that India should export only $300 billion worth of goods. It should actually today be able to export $600 billion of good. It has that capacity, but within the border reforms is what is needed. And you have an example, which you know this better than anybody else, that the export of services, particularly ICT sector, have put India on the world map because the government interference or interventions were almost non-existent. This shows that government should adopt a do no harm attitude and develop an enabling competitive environment in which the private sector can effectively function. In Pakistan, the discontinuity in political regimes and their preoccupations with their own survival has left economic reforms without any sponsors or champions. Second, empirical studies have shown that trade facilitation contributes more in stimulating flow of goods across borders than tariffs and duties. Trade facilitation would have much larger impact than simple reduction in tariffs. It has been estimated that the biggest benefits of the US-Europe agreement that is being negotiated would come from removing the regulatory barriers. In countries such as India and Pakistan, where petty bureaucracy has such powerful stranglehold, the benefits of liberalizing regulatory barriers would be substantial. So what do we need to do? Harmonize and synchronize the regulations so that the procedures are simplified and the discretionary and arbitrary powers of the petty officials is completely diluted. It will not only reduce the cost of doing business and cost of transaction, but will help both countries make a competitive inroads in each other and outside South Asia. Prohibition or specification of routes, sea, you can take it from the sea, you can take this from railways, and the road. Doesn't make sense to me. It should be left to the market players as to what is the best means of evacuating their products, rather than the government officials telling them, you can do this, but you cannot go by this route. Let them decide. All over the world, this is the practice. Similarly, we have to also remove the restriction. We micromanage to the extent that this is the type of truck, this is the capacity of the truck, otherwise the truck cannot move from one side to the other. Then you have this transshipment. Remove everything from one truck, put it on the ground, take it in another truck. I mean, this is not the way you will ever be able to make any progress. This transshipment of goods at the border is something which is antiquated. You have containerized shipments, and the traffic should be through the containers. You have scanners, and you can scan all the goods and try to figure out whether these are according to the procedures or not. How much transaction cost you are imposing on both the importer and the exporter by going through this particular ordeal. Now, in Pakistan, as I said, we have railways which don't have yards.